they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down into his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted.
And just before the choir sings this morning, I wouldn't be much of a choir director, would I, if I didn't follow up on what Molly Updegraff just did. So yes, in fact, all God's critters got a place in the choir. And I heard some of you people singing out there. I know how to do it. Yeah, I see he's smiling right there in the corner. See? Yeah, some of the rest of you are too. All God's critters got a place in the choir. Come join us. We'd love to have you. All God's children got robes. Right? So come get your robe on her and sing in the choir. Anyway, thank Molly. That was wonderful. You're here.
Thank you. is said that God is in charge of the adults. Now, I've known a few adults in my time, and some probably have said that about me, that I'm not so sure the being in charge stuck very well. But it's said that God is in charge of the adults. But the lesson in all of that is don't bumble your humble. Don't bumble your humble. History teaches us that minor mistakes can get out of control and can destroy us unless we see our secret faults and we seek forgiveness. One afternoon, a carpet layer had just finished installing a carpet in a house. He stepped out for a smoke to only realize he had lost his cigarettes. After a quick but fruitless search, he noticed that in the very center of the room, under the carpet he had just installed, there was a bump. His cigarettes were under that carpet. No sense pulling up the entire floor for a pack of smokes, he said. So he got out his mallet, his hammer, and he flattened the bump down. Not long after he's cleaning up, the woman of the house came in. Here, she said, handing his pack of cigarettes. I found them in the hallway. Now, she said, if I could only find my parakeet. I knew you would do that. Things don't always seem as they appear, do they? Sometimes a shortcut isn't the best way. It's like that today in our story from Luke. Our Pharisee is doing just what he was called to do. As a devout Jew, he took a shortcut. He bumbled his humble. We're called to be humble, but humble doesn't mean without confidence, without a little bit of swagger. Sometimes you need a little swagger in your humble. There are a couple of songs that I'm reminded of in this, and some of you may know these, and I invite you to sing along if you do. And so the first one goes like this. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. And God will lift you up higher and higher. And God will lift you up. Sing that with me if you would. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord, and God will lift you up higher and higher, and God will lift you up. You got to admit, that's a pretty humbling song, and there's a way that you can bumble your humble even in song. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. I can't wait to look in the mirror and get better looking each day. To know what sin is to love us, we must be ahead of God. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble, but to do Sometimes we know when we made a mistake, and that just might have been a mistake. Sometimes we don't know when we made a mistake. It's the ones that we don't see that can really, really bite us. The magazine Mental Floss has a list of greatest bumbles in history, and a couple of those include these. The mistake that burned down London. On the night of September 1st, 1666, the oven of the royal baker to the King of England sparked a fire. It wasn't a spectacular thing. It seemed like no big deal at first. But the fire burned for 5 whole days. In the end, it wiped out 13,000 dwellings and leveled 80% of the city. Also, the mistake that sobered America up, the Prohibition movement in the United States lasted from 1920 to 1933. And during this period, it was illegal to manufacture, transport, or sell alcoholic beverages in the United States. It seemed like a great idea at the time. Outlaw liquor, and you eliminate a whole range of social ills that are related to alcohol. But Americans, you might not know this, Americans like a drink or two. And Prohibition opened up our eyes to the ways in which organized crime will meet that demand in profitable, violent, and destructive ways. A spark jumps out of an oven, and a baker fails to snuff it. A well-intentioned ban is placed on alcohol. These small oversights, errors, and miscalculations that we do not tend to see as major mistakes can become major mistakes. But secret problems can really hurt us. They can quickly get out of control and can kill us. They should drive us to our knees, cause us to do some self-examination, and lead us to confess what the Bible calls in Psalm 19, hidden faults. In other words, they should cause us to admit to God, things with me aren't just as they seem. Jesus tells a parable about the Pharisee and the tax collector, addressing it to people who feel self-righteous and regard others with contempt. In other words, he's speaking to us, average people, who tend to see ourselves sometimes as better than average. People who might say, are said to be bumbling, they're humble. Studies show that 9 in 10 managers rate themselves as superior to their average colleagues, as do 9 in 10 college professors. Go figure that one. According to Professor of Psychology David Meyer, that most drivers, even those who have been hospitalized after accidents, believe themselves to be safer and more skilled than the average driver. The one thing that unites all human beings, regardless of age, gender, religious, economic status, or ethnic background, notes humorist Dave Barry, is that deep down inside, we believe that we are above average drivers. Jesus says that 2 men go up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and one a tax collector. The natural assumption made by anyone hearing this story is that the Pharisee is the devout person, the good driver. The tax collector, on the other hand, is the sinner, the bad driver. Sure enough, the Pharisee steps away from the crowd in order to maintain his purity before God and launches into a laundry list of his religious accomplishments. God, I thank you that I am not like other people, he says, thieves, rogues, adulterers, and even this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all of my income. He does everything right according to the standards of his day, obeying all the religious rules of the road. In terms of keeping with God's commandments, he is way above average. Then the tax collector bows his head and beats his breast and says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He's feeling so ashamed that he cannot even raise his hands and look up to heaven, which is the standard position for first century prayer. The tax collector doesn't make any boasts or excuses. He simply asks for God's mercy. There's no reason to assume that this tax collector is a particularly spectacular sinner. If he were a thief, a rogue, or an adulterer, Jesus would say so. It's much more likely that he is confessing a set of secret or hidden faults, a collection of oversights, errors, and miscalculations that only he would know. So the above-average Pharisee boasts, while the sin-sick tax collector says, I'm a sinner, have mercy on me. And they both make a connection to God, right? Wrong. In a surprising twist to the whole thing, Jesus concludes the parable by saying, I tell you, this tax collector went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalts exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. The tax collector restores his relationship to God by asking for forgiveness, while the Pharisee moves further away from God by boasting of his righteousness. This isn't what the hearers of the parable expect. They've been taught that good behavior draws you closer to God and that bad behavior drives you further away. But Jesus is insisting that unless we are aware of our secret faults and humble enough to know that we need forgiveness, we are going to discover that our minor mistakes can get out of control and they can destroy us. Think again of the historical mistakes that seemed so small at first, but then caused enormous problems. Prohibition may have been a noble idea, and a spark from a baker's oven might have seemed like no big deal, but they both turned out to be huge problems. In the same way, the Pharisees' fasting and tithing seemed noble at first, and his pride in his good behavior seemed to be a minor mistake. But together, these factors created a disaster. Without humility, there is no way for him to be right with God. When you trust God, you get God. But when you trust only yourself, you get what? Only yourself. That's right. Micah 6:8 reminds us, He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. So what are the mistakes that we make, sometimes without knowing it? It's time for us to do some searching and self-examination, confess our hidden faults, and to recognize when we've bumbled our humble. One mistake that can really bite us is our failure to see the image of God in other people around us. Step into public transportation or take a trip to the grocery store. You tend to see differences. Different skin colors, hairstyles, tattoos, no tattoos, piercings, body shapes, all kinds of those, and makeup choices and dress choices as well. Some of these differences repel you, and you step back, just like the Pharisee, that he moved away from the crowd, not wanting to associate with those people. But these differences are all superficial and don't really reflect the inner person that God sees. The real deep truth about a crowd of people in public transportation is that they are a child of God, each and every one of them, created in the image and likeness of our God. That is what we ought to be looking for, just as God does. It might manifest itself as an us or them situation, and those can be scary, if they were only just a little more like I am. Have you ever heard that one from people? Another mistake is to judge others more harshly than we judge ourselves. Think of the times you have had your temperature rise at the line in the post office, or we'll even say it, the Department of Motor Vehicles, or someplace like that. And as that line moves at a glacial pace. And then you get to the counter, the clerk messes up your transaction, and there are people behind you now that are not so happy with the pace of things going. You want to lash out at those people that are ahead of you sometimes. Pay attention, get it right, don't mess up. And then when it comes our turn, sometimes things don't go as well either, and there are people behind us feeling that same kind of thing. In our own daily work, we go easy on ourselves a lot of times because we know how it is to focus and how hard it is when we are ill or distracted by another person, or we have a personal problem that we are facing. Like a Pharisee in the parable, we see the sin and thieves and rogues and other people around us, but not in ourselves so much. And this leads others to see us as judgmental, or even the word that we all know, hypocritical. Have you heard that one about people talking about church and going to those kind of things? There aren't any of those people here, of course, today, but sometimes they're out there. Finally, we err when we're not being honest to our God, or honest with ourselves about the need for forgiveness. The tax collector saw himself clearly, and he confessed his sinfulness, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. All of this begs the question, how do I get to a place to see the image of God in others and show the mercy that God has for us instead of judgment and recognize my own need for forgiveness? You no doubt have a ready answer for that question already. I know you do, but you could suggest on the basis of the text that the answer lies in the simple prayer. A simple prayer that we should pray regularly. How can you fail to see God and others around you when you started your day by praying to God? You might do something like this. God, please show your mercy and grace to me today because I realize that I am needy and I must rely on your help. God, please show your mercy and grace to me today because I realize I am needy and I must rely on your help. What would happen if the neediest people in our world would start their day out like that? What would happen if the most powerful among us would start their day like that? Pray that prayer every morning and you'll be less critical of others. You'll look at yourself more honestly and others with compassion. Each of us needs to be forgiven whether we acknowledge it or not, just as the Pharisee needed to be cleansed of the sin of pride when he said, God, I thank you that I am not like other people. It's time to get honest with God and honest with ourselves. We cannot go home justified, restored to the right relationship with God and others, unless we admit that we need to be forgiven. The opportunity comes to us here just as it came to the Pharisee and the tax collector in the temple. The opportunity to see our mistakes, confess our hidden faults, and ask for the gift of forgiveness. A prayer for everyday use is something that we need. Perhaps it is a way for us to humble ourselves and not to bumble our humble. We might do this. So far today, God, I have done all right. I haven't gossiped. I haven't lost my temper. I haven't been greedy or grumpy or nasty or selfish or overindulgent. And I'm really glad about that, God. But in a few minutes, God, I'm going to get out of bed. And from then on, I'm probably going to need a lot more help. Thank you, God. Amen. Our hymn of dedication is an opportunity for us not to bumble our humble, and it's number 487.